SDP Solutions Senior IT Risk Advisor. Ben, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jill. I appreciate that, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. Basically, when we came up with the idea for this webinar, it really occurred to us that, speaking for myself, I've been in the MSP space for a little while, and technology's really changed, and even how we connect to the internet, which is a fairly young tool, has changed dramatically from the days of dial-up, et cetera, to where we are today. Beyond that, the utilization of these connections, where we use them, how we use them, to what ends do we use them, how they implement with existing architecture has really changed as well. And so I thought that we would just do a quick overview. We're going to talk a little bit about where the environment is today and sort of go through this and figure out, just get a pulse of where we're at. So first, we're just going to talk about sort of the evolution of this connectivity. Whoops. Every time I switch the thing, it does that. This is a pretty short timeline because we're not talking that long for internet connectivity to even be a thing. So, in the 1990s, I remember I had my first internet connection with like an AOL connection and a dial-up modem in, I would say, 96 maybe. Connecting to any kind of information outside the workplace was very rare. Everything we did was very fundamental and basic, and I don't think we need to belabor the point too much that this was simply it was almost like a luxury to connect to the internet with little bonuses rather than something that we really needed. In the 2000s, things I think really changed. Broadband started expanding everywhere. Dial-up internet connections really started becoming passé. Data was centralized in a local physical environment. When I started working in the MSP space in 2005, you could basically do a cookie cutter of what a small business might look like in terms of assets. They'd have some server in a closet. Maybe that would run their email, their domain, files, maybe some application they used. And it was just a matter of how big and how much. And everything was very much in this organization where we keep our little network closet and oftentimes in a non-ideal space. And we're all going to connect in from the outside, from our other offices, and we'll even build a terminal server and stuff like that. And it was still kind of limiting. And it certainly put a large burden on individual businesses to have really expensive, stable connections, build security, build data centers, and all of that. And then I would say from like the 2010s on, that's really where we're kind of at right now, where you would see maybe 5-6 years ago, people getting rid of in-house email servers and moving to things like, products like Gmail, and so-called hosted exchange solutions that were licensed through Microsoft were available. Eventually, Office 365 became a much bigger thing. Availability of broadband continued to expand. Alternative connections began popping up. And not only that, things like the evolution of smartphones, the ability to use apps for everything, the ability to tether internet connections or purchase a MiFi connection from like a Verizon Wireless or something like that. These things became more viable and as such created a lot more flexibility in how we connected and really made it a lot more demands in what our applications could do and how we could access data. It was to our benefit from a productivity perspective, but it obviously complicated the design and decision-making process. So what we're going to do is we're just going to evaluate. So right now we really should be evaluating our options and figure out what our organization should be thinking about when it comes to connectivity, because what one organization may do will probably vary from another one. Considering what they might just have to get done with the tech. So today, we're going to talk about a few things. The first thing is just the basic idea, traditional connections. I put traditional in quotes because there's not much tradition in such a young industry, really, versus newer technology options. And by that, I mean things like personal hotspots and things like that. We're going to talk about the concept of securing transmissions from point to point. So as we build these communications networks, maybe between offices or between some kind of cloud provider, perhaps like a Microsoft Azure or an Amazon, how do we actually make these transmissions secure? we're now sending all of this awfully sensitive data over a public internet. How do we do that in an effective way? I mean, and what do you need to think about? We're going to talk about general management concepts. So as we continue along this path of having more and more connectivity options, people using home connections or their own cell phones, their own computers, whatever, what kind of management concepts do we need to put in place, both when it comes to planning what we do, policies we communicate, so on and so forth. And then, and sort of riding on to that, just creating the rules and the policies we need. Even though we could build technology that gives us almost unlimited flexibility when it comes to work, there are reasons to sort of pump the brakes on this a little bit and say, for the sake of management, security, compliance, budgets, et cetera, we need to create some boundaries for what we do, or at least set the stage so that our staff has the proper expectations of what they should be doing with these amazing tools that we've given them. So first, why don't we talk a little bit about traditional internet connections? As I said, it's a little odd calling them traditional. Everybody knows about what I would just call cable internet solutions, and I know, Verizon might say, well, we have fiber optics. It's not cable like Comcast. I mean, fundamentally, these all operate off of the same principle. These are big telecom companies will provide some kind of connection from whatever local routers they have to your home or your business. And obviously the availability of these connections, both speed and competition, et cetera, really will vary based on geography and things like that. In very densely populated areas, we're right outside of Baltimore. In Baltimore, there are only a few places I can think of where things are really difficult to get connections out of. But if I drove out from here, Baltimore, Maryland, let's say I drove out maybe 3 hours west to, Western Maryland, those options would be probably a lot more limited and quite honestly more expensive. So they kind of bundle up, which makes sense. If you're a Comcast or a Verizon and you want to have an internet connection and make money on it, you want to put it in a place where you can sell a lot of it. These are traditionally what they would call shared line connections, where you're basically jumping on the line with everybody else, and they're building a network for that bunch of people rather than just a single individual household or business. Another traditional connection, and one we're really seeing, I mean, at least from my perspective, a lot less of, is something like MPLS or private solutions. We don't need to get too much into the tech, but the idea of MPLS is building a dedicated private path for data to travel on. Often it's with phone connections you would see in the past. But really, if you wanted to if you didn't want to use say a virtual private network and you wanted to create dedicated paths for your traffic, you might get MPLS. It can be expensive and it's kind of limited in terms of what it can do for you. It's typically not as fast as, say, like a Verizon Fios or a fiber optic connection or whatever. But there are applications in which it's still necessary. Satellites out there, usually very slow, and there's some big cost downsides. But if you have a house in the middle of the country and you perhaps need to work out of it for whatever reason, and you're not near whatever Comcast offers you, you might have to go to something like a satellite connection. And of course, the beauty is, as long as you could point your dish to where it needs to point, you have something. Now, there's a lot of downsides with satellite too. So usually we don't recommend it, but again, there may be some applications here. Another thing, and this is usually a little more viable, there's a lot of applicability for this kind of solution, is the idea of fixed wireless. So imagine if you're that same person in the middle of the country, but I could point a direct signal, a wireless signal that's very strong back to a local wired network, right? So we're getting the benefits of the Verizon Fios network with all the speed and everything that we get, except we're beaming that signal further than it should using fixed wireless technology. As you might imagine, these kinds of custom solutions have big implications when it comes to geography, the cost of implementation, stuff like that. But again, there are times where you have to look for these sorts of things depending on where you are or what kind of application you have. And as evidenced by the little thumbnail of it looks like either Windows 3.1 or maybe Windows 2000 or NT or something, you have DSL and dial-up. These things technically still exist. I see them very seldom, but they are out there. Although I would imagine if you're using one of these things, you're probably not watching this webinar. So let's move on. So a few things to consider when you're shopping for this stuff, and I don't think you have to overthink this stuff. When in terms of what carriers you use, most people are going to use the traditional type. Comcast in Baltimore, it's Comcast, Verizon. In other areas, I know there's Cox and Time Warner, etc. The first thing you should think is how much traffic does your office typically use? So internet connections very much are a speed. Speed is very much a limiting factor here. So if you have 100 employees and all of these employees are constantly taxing that internet connection by either doing their work or maybe they're browsing on YouTube or Netflix or something, or maybe they are doing large data transfers. We process video. Where I'm doing video editing and I need to send this video from one place to the other. These could be very bandwidth intensive things. So we really have to sort of take an inventory of what people are doing and the purposes of these connections. The thing is, if you have maybe a 10 or 20 megabit connection and a decent amount of staff, you can run through that connection very, very quickly. Speaking for myself personally in my personal life, I have a 75 megabit connection into my home, which is great for me as an individual. I can stream 4K videos. I can download computer games off the internet. I can do, my work from home when I decide to do that. All of that is fine for me. But if I was doing all of that, and then let's say I had 5 roommates and everybody was doing the same things I did, they wanted to stream these 4K videos from Netflix and they wanted to do their work and they wanted to download their games, we could kill that 75 megabit connection real quick. So before you make a commitment, just sort of take that list, take that inventory. What are we actually trying to accomplish here? And if you're not familiar with what kind of tax this is going to have on your bandwidth, talk about it with an expert like us or something, and we'll help you. We'll help guide you towards the right kind of connection that you need. What's the nature of your work? So is everything sort of centralized? Is all the work happening in-house and then every so often you're sending something out to the internet? Or are you constantly going out to the internet because you have a software as a service solution where you're browsing to that site all day? That could really matter. If you have a database that's in the cloud, that means every time you send an instruction or every time you load a new page, you're pulling data on your internet connection. So that's super important. And again, I mentioned it before, but what kind of data are we dealing with? Media can be very, very large. Anything with video in it can be very big to transmit back and forth. And oftentimes the upload speed, the speed in which you send data off, can, depending on your connection, can be slower than the speed in which you receive that data. So that's another consideration we have to make. Another thing you have to consider is, do you need something like an off-site recovery solution or redundancy or other kind of background traffic that uses your internet connection? We've been talking about what people do with their connections. What does Joe do on his day-to-day job? But regardless of what Joe does with his job on the back end, if the server he's working on is being replicated to, say, some cloud service provider, or it is being backed up, hourly imaged or something like that, or whatever the solution is, that stuff, that sort of the factory working, if you will, of the technology, that all takes up bandwidth too. So that has to be part of the consideration. Again, this is where having some expertise in the situation before you make these decisions really matters. If you're thinking that you need a new connection, it's really the right time to get your IT managers involved and make sure that this is a robust discussion before you make a commitment that maybe is difficult to change. Another thing you might consider is load balancing and backups. So, most internet connections are pretty reliable. I mean, again, speaking for myself in my home, my internet connection, I've had a couple issues, but for the most part, it's been pretty stable. And the reality is, if my internet went out for 6 hours in my home, life would move on. I would be okay. Yeah, maybe I wouldn't be able to watch Netflix for a while or be able to work from home that day or whatever, but things would be okay. But let's say I was running a data center and people were relying on stuff in my house to connect to it. I had a server farm for whatever reason. This is obviously a very fictional scenario, but say I had this and people were relying on that. 6 hours would be unacceptable, which means that even though I may never really utilize it, I may end up deciding to get a backup internet connection or load balance those internet connections so that, say, 2 100 megabit connections can serve all people instead of flipping the switch between one and the other when one fails. That's a consideration that should be made. It may be also that the local carriers that you use, we contacted Comcast, they told us they could give us 50 megabits down, but really that's really not enough, but this is all Comcast could give us, so we brought in this other carrier and we're load balancing with them so we can increase our capacity. Those are things that we might have to discuss. IP address needs. Again, this is where technical expertise probably matters. Most individuals don't need a special IP address consideration. They just get dynamic addresses from their carrier and they're good to go. But if you have an office that has a fixed asset, something where the address, the phone number, if you will, needs to stay the same all the time, someone is talking to a direct point at any given time. This is often the case if you're hosting something in your office. Let's say you're hosting email, you're hosting a website, or if you have a server that people remote into, say a Citrix server or a terminal server that people remote into, where they need to go to the same destination all the time. You might need to lease what is called static IP addresses. There's a lot that can go into this, so we're not going to talk about all this stuff on the call today, but I would say it's a really important discussion for a business in particular. And then lastly, the thing I wrote here is what do remote staff use to connect? So if your remote staff is just connecting in to check their email once in a while, that's one thing. If they're needing a constant connection because they're basically saving and downloading files all day that they're mapping to a drive to share files with staff, they really need to have a stable connection on their end as well. So you should really consider that before making some of these decisions. I'm going to pivot a little bit to like anytime, anywhere connections. And obviously I have to put this in quotes because they're not always anytime, anywhere, right? I mean, everyone's been into spots where things don't quite work the way we expect. Mobile hotspots are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more ubiquitous, especially for people who are road warriors, teleworkers. This is great, right? I mean, internet connection on most smartphones is usually pretty fast, or on these MiFi things, they're pretty fast relative to dial-up, I would say. They're not as fast as, say, a Comcast or Verizon Fios connection typically. But if you wanted to, say, watch a YouTube video, it'll get the job done. If you wanted to download emails or whatever, you can get the job done with one of these things. But really, when you compare them, bit by bit to other traditional connections, they are kind of expensive. I mean, a lot of times you'll pay. It might seem cheap, you spend $20 a month on the MiFi subscription, but it gives you very limited amounts of bandwidth that you can use, and compared to a Fios connection where basically it could be unlimited, that's kind of pricey, especially if you say, well, I have a 2 gigabyte data cap and I use 10 gigabytes this month, and instead of paying $20, I spent $100 or whatever additional fees they charge you. These things can be quite costly. The other thing I would say is that it's not really viable as a primary office location type solution. So I have seen situations where cellular cards have been used as like a backup for a load balancing thing. We just need to have a connection, and yeah, we don't care about the price. We're just going to kick it in when we need to. So we bought this special card for cell phone connectivity. That may be a good function in an office, but certainly using say an AT&T wireless internet connection cannot be a primary connection. It's just not there yet. That may change in the future. Who knows with this 5G stuff that they're talking about, where that goes exactly, but I wouldn't recommend it in 2019. This is another one. It's WiMAX for mobile broadband. This is a little different. So a mobile hotspot uses your cellular connection, the 4G connection that you use to connect to send text and do, phone calls and browse the internet on your cell phone. WiMAX mobile broadband is a little different. It's when a carrier broadcasts an internet connection, just like the Wi-Fi in your office, except they do it, to the max, wide. These are could be viable in the sense that at least they're there all the time. They may not have some of the limitations, but they are often expensive. In Baltimore, I know it's something that's picking up a little bit from Sprint, I believe. I know Sprint does a lot of work in Baltimore in terms of experimentation for whatever reason. But it's not really super fast. Comparing it to what you would consider traditional, a Comcast or Verizon Fios connection, they tend to be a fraction of that speed. But obviously that's a trade-off, right? You get Comcast or Verizon, you're stuck in a specific location. In this, you could bring your laptop all over town and you have that connection. So there's definitely applicability to it, and you just need to keep that in mind if you decide to go that route for whatever reason. So again, just going back, so we've talked about these options. Let's just talk about a few things we need to consider about all of them. So modern systems give us a lot of options. And if you opt into everything you could possibly do, we often create system loopholes and security issues. So the more we have to manage. And while it may seem appealing to set up something for a convenience factor, we have to ask ourselves, by setting up this solution, quote unquote, have we created other problems? Have we now opened up a compliance, a hole in our compliance? A good example that came to me yesterday was, and this is not so much a connectivity thing, but a way people use stuff. HIPAA, which is for medical professionals, a standard of data privacy, doesn't have a specific standard for how email is used and retained for patient information. But they do say you have to be able to say when you've disclosed patient information to third parties. So you can either buy an email solution that archives all this stuff, and so you can guarantee that you could communicate all this stuff, or you could create strong policies and limitations that email is not used for this purpose. Both get to the same goal, which is limit the flow of data, but one requires less technology and more management. That's just one example. One thing everyone should consider is if you are connecting to the internet and doing anything sensitive, you should use a VPN to encrypt and make traffic private no matter the destination. So this is, traditionally it used to be, especially, and this is going off my history, in 2005 when I started in the MSP space, we would build VPNs between sites so that the 5 offices could all connect to one another and communicate securely and in a stable way. That was how we would traditionally use VPN. Today, VPN is used much more broadly. It makes what travels on the public highways, here in Baltimore, I would say like 695, the public highway. It makes what happens on that road private. So you can't see what's happening in the car that's driving on 695. You might see that a car exists, but you don't know what it's doing. While this is good for point-to-point connections, there's also a case to be made for making this for all connections, especially for remote workers. I'm connecting from a hotel in Austin, Texas to my data center in Washington, D.C. I am pretty confident my machine is secure. I'm using my personal Wi-Fi, MiFi, cellular connection, all of that. But you know what? I'm going to use a VPN, and that way, every piece of data that I encrypt from this connection, or that I transmit from this connection, is now encrypted, and I can be confident that some hacker isn't out there spying on my data and pulling out my credit card number or pulling out the sensitive information that I was sending to another staff member, that sort of thing. So I would say personal VPNs, NordVPN is an option. There's a lot of different products out there. Are very good, especially for people who are working remotely. If you're concerned about privacy, I would consider VPN. Major sites, so egress points, like we would call them, main offices, etc., should have a hardware firewall, something that controls the flow of traffic from the modem or router from Comcast, Verizon, etc., back into your network, something that says this traffic's allowed to come in, that traffic's not allowed to come in. This is a basic thing that everybody should have, and it's super important for cybersecurity, for stable connectivity, for in many cases forensics. If something should happen, it really should not be an option. If you're in a single user or a home office, we would probably make the controls more modest. All of these controls that we talk about, VPN, firewalls, policies, etc., it's all a matter of applicability. We're not going to use all these tools in every situation. The idea is, let's determine what the individual's risk is or what the organization's risk is, the factors we're concerned about, and let's come up with a reasonable plan. There is no 100% secure, 100% stable solution. We're never going to get there. Let's come up with something that we can be reasonably confident in and that we can live with when things maybe hiccup once in a while, or at least have the controls in place so that when things do hiccup, we're not in a crisis mode. Other security considerations, and this is something, if you've attended any of my webinars before, these are things that I really think everybody should be talking about. Security and risk management should be a part of every conversation you have about technology. So every time you're talking about making big wholesale changes, replacing servers, replacing PCs, Windows 7 is going to be end of life soon, so we need to move to Windows 10. Getting new applications in place, setting up telework, anything that we're doing that touches technology, security and risk have to be a part of the discussion. Today, 2019, if you are using some kind of username and login to get into a system, especially if that system is remote, like a software as a service solution, we do this with online banking now. Office 365, certain flavors of Office 365 offer this. You can implement this into internal networks. Multi-factor authentication is a huge risk mitigator when it comes to security. Passwords are only so secure, but these constantly changing tokens that you get access on, say, a phone or a personal token or even something that goes to your email is extremely valuable. And there's a reason why compliance standards are increasingly making this a requirement. PCI made this a requirement as of last year for remote access. And I would say anyone who is concerned with people saying, logging in who they think they are, should really consider how this could be implemented into their system because it's very achievable. I'm always wary of public networks. I'm not going to say never use them. I use them. But keep in mind that you don't know how that network's been maintained. You don't know who's sniffing for data on that network. You don't know what else is going on. And of course, you don't know who's surrounding you who might be getting this stuff. So if you're going to use a public network, make sure you're taking the proper precautions. Make sure you're using a personal VPN. Make sure you, if it's really sensitive work, consider not doing it in public. I mean, it's just a good idea in general. Certainly you wouldn't do your taxes in a Starbucks. It seems like maybe not the best idea. So we should probably take a similar kind of attitude towards public Wi-Fi and stuff in general. It's fine if what you're looking to do is check a couple emails that are casual or you want to watch YouTube. But if you're trying to do really important work, maybe not a great idea to do in public. Encryption. This can be applied to a number of things. So obviously I've talked about it as it pertains to transmission. We want to use VPNs and other encryption tools to make sure that the things we send from one point to the other are not readable by others. But additionally, we should consider, outside of the connections, if we're bringing devices, phones, laptops that are going to store sensitive information on them, those devices should be encrypted. The connection can be very secure, but someone could lose the laptop and all of a sudden we have this treasure trove of data assets that a bad guy could use for bad things. Well, encryption can help mitigate that risk. So consider that if you're going to have teleworkers or people working as road warriors. Lastly, maybe most importantly in 2019 is phishing and social engineering. There is no safe internet connection or VPN tunnel or firewall or whatever that can overcome when a user is tricked into allowing a bad guy into the system. So your team must be aware of what a phishing attack might look like, how they need to respond to it. I would strongly consider phishing testing. I would strongly consider security awareness training. Come up with some kind of program to keep your people aware of the threats they're going to face to them. It's not just something that technology can solve. If the user is tricked into giving somebody access, there is no amount of technology we can use to change that. So I think that this has to be something that every organization discusses because it's real. Every client I meet with always asks me about these weird emails they get. The big one I see now, I know we get it here at DPS. I got it with a client I met with yesterday, are the so-called emails that say, oh, you've been browsing some very naughty sites, alluding to your salacious behavior on the internet. And that's designed to create urgency and trick you into doing something you might not normally do. People need to be hardened against this and create a culture of skepticism and care and compliance. So I know I talk about it all the time, but I'm going to keep talking about it. It's that important. So other design considerations, this is a little outside of security. This is more about general risks. Disaster recovery, one great thing about the flexibility we have in connectivity and bandwidth and varieties of solutions and so on the cloud is that we have so much more of an ability at a better price, even though there's still an investment involved. It's a more reasonable investment in disaster recovery. If we do have a server on site still, we have way more options to recover to another location. We don't even have. It used to be that we would replicate a server to another site that the client would own or lease. That doesn't even make sense anymore. We can now replicate to cloud servers where we don't have to worry about physical locations and stuff like that. These are great things. And so if we're really concerned about keeping things up and avoiding extended downtime, let's talk about what tools and such we need to have access to pretty much 100% of the time. And let's see what we can do to make that happen and if it can be done on a reasonable budget. Because those opportunities exist now. Collaboration. If you're not using Slack or Google Hangouts or Skype for Business, which is Microsoft's tool now, or some of these other things, you should really consider it. I mean, there's so many positive collaboration tools that you can use through cell phones, et cetera. I mean, I just think they're great things. GoToMeeting, even, these web conference tools. It was great last week when it snowed here in Baltimore, and we were able to hold our management meeting remotely. Some people were here in the office, some people dialed in. We were sharing screens, we were having a productive conversation. Right before this meeting, we had the same meeting in the office, and I could tell you that we didn't really have any substantive differences in how we conducted that meeting because we had the right collaboration tools in place. So really consider that. I mean, this is really where things are going. We have to, there's more demands on us as workers than there used to be in terms of how much we have to get done and how responsive we have to be and things like that. So giving people collaboration and communications tools will really help that stuff. And it may seem like it's subtle, but I think it really smooths things out and improves processes. Another thing we can consider now, and this is very much an applicability thing, so it may not work for everybody, is the idea of virtual desktops. Let's say we're building a cloud solution where all the processing is being done on the servers, and it exists in some data center, or maybe it's replicated to multiple data centers out in the cloud. It gives us an opportunity, if we want, to use more light computers, things like Google Chromebooks or terminals or what have you, and really make it so that our brain power, our engines are existing on these servers, but that people just get very slim devices. The cloud and high-powered server tools and hosting solutions make this a lot more possible. Now, whether it applies to you or not, or it's a good idea for you, or if it's in your budget, or it makes sense, or it's a positive experience for you, is a totally different story. But it's something worth consideration. Lastly, but certainly not least, I want to talk about acceptable use policies. So we're giving people all these options, and people can work, in all these locations and all these different ways. it's super important to define what those rules are and what people can do. First, we have the bane of my existence, which is data sprawl. We want to define what data staff is allowed to work with, where and how they're allowed to touch, where it's stored, etc. What we don't want by giving people the flexibility to connect is that they have the flexibility then to store data. Well, I want to store it on my laptop instead of storing it on the server like we want them to. There has to be rules about where the data goes, how long the data is allowed to be quote unquote checked out to the device versus when it belongs back in SharePoint or the file server or the database or whatever. We need to make sure that people are using these things in the right way. We don't want to create a situation where sensitive data that we want is stored on a laptop that we no longer have access to because it's sprawled that far. Data sharing. Well, if people have all these tools where they can send data to third parties or email them in different places or do whatever, there needs to be rules about that. These types of data we've considered to be sensitive as an organization, and as such, we are only sharing them with these individuals and in these ways. So you can only send it with encrypted email to our accountants, and at this time with this validation. There really should be defined policies in terms of what people are allowed to share, how and where. Because we don't want somebody just going rogue and saying, well, I have my cell phone, so I just texted them the information, or I put it on a USB drive and gave it to them or something like that. That may not be acceptable. It may be creating new risks for us. So we have to define those policies. Device management. I've been telling people to inventory everything, including mobile devices, including personally owned devices. And you can separate them. You can say these are the assets that the company has bought versus these are the assets that people use to connect in. I think in general, it's good to know what devices people are using, even if maybe you're not going to really use that information too much. You should consider mobile device management. Most organizations that I deal with have people who use their personal cell phones to connect to company assets like email, etc. Mobile device management allows us to force policies and force security on devices that may not have them by default. And when they're personally owned, the only person that can control those are the individual, unless we have mobile device management. So I would really strongly consider taking inventory of that and making sure that people are using their personal devices in a way that's acceptable, but also that you've created security systems in place that have reasonable controls for this. And fortunately, mobile device management, again, is a very achievable technology to implement in most environments. We should be restricting access. So if we're going to give people the keys to the car and we're going to, let's say, go out and hit the road and you can drive everywhere you want to go and anytime, any day you want, we need to only allow the people who are ready to do so to do that. I mean, when we want to teach our kids how to drive, we don't just give them the keys and say, enjoy, figure it out on the way, do your training or whatever. That's what a stop sign is, that sort of stuff, that sort of thing. We make them take driver's ed and they have to practice and they have to drive around some orange cones in a parking lot or whatever. We really should take the same kind of philosophy to our technology, right? If people don't know what they need to be aware of for security, do you want them accessing your computers where they could breach your data and which would hold you responsible for the liabilities associated with that? Do you? Of course you don't. We need to create some kind of structure in place to educate and train people and engage with people so that once we give them the keys to the car, that we can be reasonably confident that they're doing so responsibly, as well as that they know what to do should something come up with security, that they're handling the incidents right, that they're not breaking procedure on incident management, so on and so forth. So before we go to questions, let's just talk about a few key takeaways that I wanted to go through today. We want to focus on logistics. Where are you working? What are you working on? How do you need to work? As always, we are technology people, right? We can help design the systems and make them work for you. But you, as the decision maker, as the business owners, as the operations managers, whatever, you guys know what you need to accomplish better than we do and how it needs to be done. If you can articulate a workflow to us and what people do and how they need to do it, we can build systems or tell you where the challenges are in that. But ultimately, I want you to focus on what you're looking to accomplish. And if you can communicate that to us, to our account managers, to our people, that what you're looking to achieve, we can really build technology around that, I think. Determine what you're going to be working on and the security compliance concerns around it. So if you haven't defined what sensitive data you're using and what you're liable for, you have to do that. Because aside from building a solid system, we're going to have to do these things within the confines of regulation. So that has to be a part of the conversation when you're doing this stuff. Anything you do, we should document and share with technology solutions designers. I think I kind of talked about that a little bit. We generally recommend implementing dynamic and flexible tech solutions. Things keep improving, but we have to pick the right options. So right now, if you said to me, hey, Ben, what kind of hosted email solution should I use? I would almost certainly say Microsoft Office 365. It's not to say that there aren't other useful products, but for most people, that's a good fit. In 5 years, will that be the solution? I don't know. That could very well change. What is good is if we can have solutions where if we decide we want to make a change, we want to add an application into our mix, we want to double our size as an organization, we want to implement new security features because now we're subject to new compliance standards that we weren't subject to before. It's really good to implement solutions that allow us the flexibility to do this so that we're not reinventing the wheel all the time. Every so often, you do need to make big wholesale changes, but obviously it's really better to do these things incrementally. The only way you can do these things incrementally, though, is to have a long-term ongoing plan with timelines, goals, budgets, ideas, and review, and with the idea that these things will change in the future. We must communicate policies and expectations regarding accessible work. No technology in place will get people to operate responsibly if we haven't made that part of our message. Everything that we're talking about here, internet connections, firewalls, VPNs, whatever, has to be maintained and reevaluated. We can't have solutions that are end of life. We shouldn't have solutions that are legacy, because the longer they sit in place, the harder they're going to be to move into the modern era. And we shouldn't be afraid to reevaluate this stuff. So we've implemented a system, a year out, is this still doing what we needed to do? And we don't want to get into any kind of sunken cost fallacies. At the time, with a lot of the decisions we made, they made sense at the time. I was talking with a client about their hosted email solution they were using, and I kept talking about 365, and then the question is, well, why was this good then and 365 is good now? And the answer to that question is what he said. At the time, that solution made a lot of sense given the factors that we knew about. In 2019, those factors are different. Microsoft's product's more competitive. It offers a better overall solution. It's more dynamic. It's more flexible. Yeah, you could keep the other thing that's there, but maybe it makes more sense to move to something that's a little more standardized, that's going to be flexible with the other systems you implement. Because I can guarantee you that the solution that this gentleman was using is not going to integrate with the software as a service that he's looking to purchase, but Microsoft Office 365 will. So we shouldn't be afraid to maintain and reevaluate these solutions and look at them through a new lens every so often. That's part of the planning process, and it's how we achieve technology success. That's the prepared content for today. I thank everybody for being on this, and we're going to take some questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. Like Ben said, if you have any questions, you can type them out in the question box, and we'll go ahead and answer them. So we'll see if anyone has any questions. Okay, it looks like we do have a couple coming in, Ben. What is the best ISP? Should I use Comcast or Verizon?
I don't have a personal preference for ISPs in the sense that I don't think like Comcast has some special sauce that Verizon doesn't, and vice versa. I think you have to look at the options on their merits. I think there's going to be a lot of situations where Comcast is a better solution versus Verizon. And I speak about Comcast Verizon, but it could be any number of carriers. Those are the ones that are big here in Baltimore. But again, it's more like, what are they offering me? What are the prices? What features can they give me? You might even decide to use both in certain scenarios and go from there. But generally, these products as a whole are kind of commoditized. They do the same things. It's just a matter of what's around them and what fits your organization. So I would look at them more like products in class of products. It's almost like, would I rather have a Toyota or a Honda? And you look at these things and you say, well, they have different benefits for different people. And some people might like a Toyota and some people might like a Honda. And I'm not going to point the finger and say that one is wrong and one is right. It depends on the person. So.
Okay, great. Okay, another question came in is, how many IP addresses will I need? And what is the difference between static and dynamic IP addresses?
That's a good question. So as far as how many, the vast majority of people will not even need one static IP address. They'll use a dynamic connection. So pretty much any home user, et cetera, you don't have to worry about this stuff, period. In a business, usually the carriers will offer, and I haven't shopped this for myself in a while, but what I remember happening is they would offer usually, and these are on business connections typically, one static IP address, 8, which is usually 5 usable static IP addresses, or 16 static IP addresses. Basically, the number of phone numbers you get for your internet connection. And if you have a complicated data center in any kind of way, you might need the 5 usable ones. It's definitely one of those types of conversations that you need to review with your IT planners, because this can be a very engineering-heavy decision. So you have to go in and you have to say, well, what do we need IP addresses for, and what doesn't need an IP address, and where can you use a port instead, or something like that. It takes some engineering. The second question, do I need static or dynamic? So static, the difference between them is static is never changing. When you get that IP address, that is your IP address. It's like your home address, right? Your home address never changes. It's not like the mailman comes over one day and says, you know what, you were 9160 Red Branch Road last week, but you know what, today you're 9260 Red Branch Road. Enjoy. But that's kind of what like a dynamic IP address is. Most people are actually fine with dynamic, but if you have a fixed asset that is not moving, that you need to connect to constantly, you can't have that address change stuff. So you need a static one. They'll typically charge you more for it. It's not usually that much, especially if you're getting a business connection that's kind of more on the expensive side anyway. But again, I would recommend, once you get to that part of the decision, run it through your IT managers, make sure that they're okay with the solution before you sign the contract.
Okay, great. And we do have one more question that came in. My provider says I get 5 gigabits a month of downloads on my plan. Is that sufficient?
The answer is maybe. If you're talking 5 gigabits a month, you're probably talking about a mobile broadband connection, like a cell phone or something like that. And that's not a lot in the big scheme of things. To give perspective, a single layer DVD movie, which is not high definition, is 4.7 gigabytes. So that chews up an entire 5 gigabyte cap if you were to download one movie. But you might not be downloading movies. You might just be saying on that cellular connection, I'm just checking emails. Well, the 5 megabits or the 5 gigabits per month may be sufficient, because those individual emails are so much smaller. Ask yourself, with that cap, what do I need to do with it every month? And if you're saying it's just casual stuff, then you're fine. But if you're saying I'm going to be working with this thing constantly and I'm always going to be using it, you could easily run through that 5 gigabyte cap, and you may pay extra fees or get throttled or something. Throttling is when they lower the speed after a certain point. And so you have to look at that stuff. If it's insufficient, you might have to have a call with your carrier where you say, hey, I need more. What can you offer me? This is kind of a natural limitation of cellular connections. You know, they're not going to want to give you a whole lot. The cellular industry made a big stink several years ago. You know, when the iPhone came out and people were getting data plans originally, and we're talking, I guess, 2007, everything was unlimited because it wasn't an issue. And then these carriers started saying, wait a second, we don't like giving people unlimited data on their phones. And so we're going to start putting these caps in. And now, of course, they're coming back around. And you have other carriers like T-Mobile saying, well, no, you don't have a cap. It's like, it's basically just a resource being limited to you. So at any rate, I would say it's probably, the 5 gigabits is definitely for a mobile connection. And if you're just doing casual stuff, fine. Anything more serious, probably not fine. And you should expect more fees per month if you go down that path.
Okay, so hopefully that answered the question. Yeah, it looks like we're all out of questions. So we can go ahead and wrap up.
Okay. Oh, whoops. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Sorry I had these little PowerPoint issues. Appreciate it. We'll be doing another one next month. Expect to see stuff on it shortly. And again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments or anything else. So thanks again.
Yep, and a recording of the webinar will be emailed out and available on our website later today or early tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.